End of story, the Tomahawks for Ukraine were probably just a token Trump used to force Putin back to the table of negotiations. My friends, we just witnessed yet another dramatic geopolitical turn between Trump and Ukraine. Remember how a couple months ago Trump said Ukraine would have to cede territory to Ukraine in order to end the war? Remember the heated exchange at the White House? Well, after months of pointless negotiations with Russia, Trump did a 180 and was now ready to supply weapons to Ukraine. Tomahawk missiles. A very stupid idea. I don't know who thought of this, considering that the Tomahawks are mainly launched from warships. We'll talk more about the Tomahawks later in the video. Trump's repositioning seemed total because on the 24th of September, the BBC reported Trump even went further by stating that Kyiv can win all of Ukraine back from Russia. This drama between Trump and Zelensky was finally about to end when, just yesterday, from the Financial Times, we learned Trump urged Zelensky to accept Putin's terms or face destruction. We're back at it again. We'll talk about all this, but first let's take a step back. Trump talked to Putin for months. He invited Putin on US soil in Alaska, but in the end, these negotiations came to a deadlock. Put simply because freezing the front where it stands right now is not suitable for either Russia or Ukraine. And then tensions increased between the US and Russia after several waves of drones and missile strikes on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities right after these negotiations and these talks. Here from the end of August, we can read Trump very angry with Putin as Russia's strikes on Ukraine continue despite peace push. And a couple days later, dozens of Russian drones entered Polish airspace. NATO airspace. I've made an entire video about it. As a result, Trump finally accepted that there wasn't going to be a ceasefire, and that, as US president, he had no other choice but to support Ukraine, or at least support Ukraine enough to convince Russia to give up and to accept a ceasefire. But of course, negotiations once again lead nowhere, and this is what Trump said on the 18th of September.
The one that I thought would be easiest would be because of my relationship with President Putin, but he's let me down. He's really let me down.
And then on the 23rd of September, Trump published this post where he said, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Wow, just wow, that was my first reaction when I read this. So let's analyze this more in depth, step by step. The original border from where the war started means the front lines you can see in white from the 24th of February 2022. So it was bordering part of Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts, aka the separatist republics, as well as Crimea along the Isthmus of Perikop, which, as a reminder, was annexed by Russia in 2014. So this is probably what Trump meant by the original borders from where this war started. But then Trump continued, why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years. A war that should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. This is pure trolling. It reminds me of this famous painting of the Zaporozhian Cossacks writing a letter to the Ottoman Sultan, saying the Russians could have won in 1 week is low-key insulting to the armed forces of Ukraine. You know what? Maybe I should do a video about what really happened in 2022. But in summary, the Russians thought they could bully Ukraine and had false expectations of a political resolution. So right off the bat, the Russian invasion plan had numerous flaws. For example, they expected to fight against the Ukrainian army they faced in 2014-2015. And because of that, the Russian army relied too much on the militias of these separatist republics that were poorly trained and equipped. This poor assessment of the situation led to high casualties and multiple setbacks on the battlefield. But then, Putin replied to this by saying, if Russia is a paper tiger, then what is NATO? Ouch. Then Trump talked about the poor state of the Russian economy. Look, I'm not an expert in this domain, so I cannot say if it's true or not. But from what I read, some sources claim Russia is facing severe gasoline shortages, and others say it is quite exaggerated, so I don't know. And yes, I'm honest, if I don't know, I'm gonna tell you. Trump concluded his post by saying Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form, and who knows, maybe even go further than that. Hold on. This is huge. Let's break this down because this is a completely different thing than what he said a couple sentences earlier. At first, Trump talked about the borders from where the war started, so we established that at February 2022. The white line you can see on the map, but now he mentioned the country of Ukraine in its original form. This means the 2014 border with all of Donbass and Crimea included. Essentially, we're talking about Ukraine's maximalist war goals. It's completely crazy, completely insane. The majority of Ukraine commanders agree that Ukraine's offensive potential was essentially wiped out after the 2023 summer counteroffensive. And look, I even have a quote. Former Brigade Commander Kupol said, "Our extreme combat potential ended at the Zaporozhye counteroffensive." As a reminder, we already talked about this Commander Kupol, and he was demoted and had a lot of problems in the AFU because he was just too honest. Fast forward 2 years and Ukraine has barely enough reserves to fill in frontline units with enough riflemen. What kind of offensive can they possibly launch? Kursk 2.0? An operation which, by the way, annihilated Ukraine's last mobile reserves. But wait, there's more. Trump also said maybe even go further than that. It's not only the 2014 borders. Trump is essentially okay with Ukraine invading Russia in return. Yeah, well, wow. Invading Russia. That idea will totally not backfire. Not only is that completely unrealistic at the moment, but one of the most recent historical examples of this idea is the Iran-Iraq War. After successfully repulsing the Iraqi invasion, the Iranians wanted to invade Iraq in return. This truly unnecessary political objective cost them hundreds of thousands of casualties for nothing. On the 25th of September, the Washington Post reported, Trump says Kyiv can win back all its land. It's not that simple. That's exactly it. It's not that simple. The article states that the momentum is on Russia's side and most officials instead predict the grinding war to continue. An anonymous NATO diplomat added the hard battlefield realities that in Donbass, over the last couple of months, the Russians made progress square kilometer by square kilometer, and despite all the billions we give Ukraine, it has proven impossible to stop them. The diplomat then added, the Ukrainians need to mobilize and it's up to us to equip and train those brigades. That's great in theory, but that was exactly what France wanted to do with the 155 mechanized brigade. The intention was there, it was a great idea. But then we remember how the AFU ruined the entire project before it was even born. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I made a couple videos about it, I'll put them in the description below. If so many analysts agree on the dire situation of the AFU, how did Trump come to this conclusion? Well, we can speculate that in preparation for the meeting with Zelensky, Trump mainly communicated with Waltz and Kellogg. We also know that Kellogg visited Kyiv in July, where he met the Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi, Budanov, Hnatov, the Chief of the General Staff of the AFU, and then visited Ukraine again in August and in September. At least one of his visits was an obvious inspection of the armed forces of Ukraine. Trump needed a former soldier to check the status of the Ukrainian military. As a reminder, Keith Kellogg served in the Special Forces in Vietnam, then was Chief of Staff of the 82nd Airborne during the Gulf War, and then took command of the 82nd Airborne in 1996. A very impressive resume. In the end, some analysts believe that Waltz and Kellogg must have conveyed to Trump that Russia has not made significant progress on the battlefield in recent years. Now, is this factual? Well, this was the frontline situation on January 1st, 2024. And this is the frontline situation now in mid-October, on the 20th of October to be precise, according to Deep State UA map. From this zoomed out perspective, the battlefield changes are almost unnoticeable. However, if you zoom in on the specific theater of operations, we can see that Russian gains are quite significant, especially considering the war objectives is taking the Donbass. As always, the commanders of the Ukrainian armed forces told US officials what they wanted to hear. That Ukraine is preparing some sort of offensive that will require support from the US, particularly in terms of intelligence. I hope this is not legit because otherwise we're entering again in the age of PR stunts, costly PR stunts. But at the same time, perhaps the Ukrainians had no other choice but to say these things. Because of the American way of war. America is a country of winners, and winners score goals. You can't win by staying in defense. On the 28th of September, Politico reported Zelensky says mega deal in works for US arms purchases. The package under discussion is reportedly worth an estimated $90 billion. Isn't this exactly what I told you in my video regarding peace talks last year in November? In my video, I mentioned how Mike Pompeo brought up an idea of a $500 million package, but the idea is the same. Allow Ukraine to purchase massive quantities of US-made weapons through some sort of Lend-Lease program. What type of weapons are we talking about? We don't have the full list yet, but we got part of an answer on the 29th of September. Trump likely to greenlight Ukraine using long-range strikes on Russia. Zelensky said if we are threatened by blackouts in the capital of Ukraine, then the Kremlin should know there will also be blackouts in the capital of Russia. The message is pretty clear. I think everyone understands that Ukraine is losing on the battlefield, so they have to find new ways to strike Russia and force them to a standstill. In this case, we're talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles that have a maximum range of 2,500 kilometers. Well, Tomahawk cruise missiles, a real game changer. I know what you're thinking. We'll talk about this in a minute. That means, in theory, from Lviv, the Ukrainians can strike St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, and even go as far as Yekaterinburg beyond the Ural Mountains. I guess that's the Wunderwaffe that will definitely change the course of the war. Well, that's what George Barras believes. He wrote the following on Twitter: Russia launches 500 plus Shahed drones at Ukraine every few days. If Ukraine had Tomahawk missiles, Ukraine could destroy the factory in Tatarstan that has the capacity to produce 2,700 of them monthly. Yes, of course, those are definitely strategic objectives that Ukraine would want to target, but we know that the first thing they will strike is Moscow. Anyway, that's all jolly in theory, but in practice, Tomahawks are made to be launched from naval platforms, which Ukraine doesn't have. It's actually so stupid. I don't know if it's the Ukrainians that asked for Tomahawk missiles or if it's the Americans that suggested them, but I don't even have the words. Absolutely débile. From all the weapons in the US arsenal, this is perhaps one of the most inadequate for Ukraine. The Telegraph reported Ukraine prepares for delivery of Tomahawk missiles. It can't fire. First of all, the delivery depends on Trump's mood. But from a technical perspective, the only way to launch these Tomahawks would be through ground-based vertical launch systems. And for this, Ukraine needs Typhoon launchers. I checked, and the US Army currently has 2 Typhoon batteries only. 8 launchers in total. 8. Again, it's really so stupid in my opinion. It's not even the meme of the Wunderwaffen like the Storm Shadow missiles or the F-16s. At this moment, Ukraine cannot even fire these Tomahawk missiles. There are many other US-made weapons that Ukraine could use, like basic armored vehicles. The US military has thousands of them just taking dust in warehouses. And apart from the technical perspective, the Americans are not really sure what the Ukrainians will actually target with the Tomahawks. Low-key, they fear that they're going to use them against civilian targets. And honestly, it's not an irrational fear, considering Zelensky's statements a few weeks earlier. End of story, the Tomahawks for Ukraine were probably just a token Trump used to force Putin back to the table of negotiations and to get him on the phone. That seemed to have worked because they did jump on a call and, surprise, surprise, from the Financial Times we learned Trump urged Zelensky to accept Putin's terms or face destruction. Ah shit, here we go again. That's right, Trump and Zelensky met once again, and as you can expect, the meeting went horribly wrong. From what I read, it descended into a shouting match with cursing all the time. Apparently, Trump was shown the battlefield map of Ukraine and he just pushed the map to the side. According to sources, the scenes resembled that of Zelensky's infamous Oval Office visit in February. Next week, high-level advisors from Russia and the United States will meet at an undisclosed location. And then Trump will meet Putin once again in Hungary. Let's see how it goes. That's all I have for you today. See you in the next one.